Right. Well, welcome. Thank you for tuning in for what is the first in a series of videos on species distribution modeling in R. I'm fortunate enough to work with a number of people at EcoCommons that make this kind of thing possible. My name's Rob, though. I have a background in ecological modeling, and I'm currently the Change and Communications Manager at EcoCommons and help Amelia and Elisa put together training materials and other things. So I just want to highlight what we're going to cover today. So essentially, we're going to give you an overview of what species distribution modeling is. This first module isn't going to cover any of the code. It's just going to cover some of the critical things that I think you need to consider other than the workflow. So what are some real practical considerations that you need to consider in order to determine whether your model is doing everything you want it to do, I suppose. And so we'll be talking about a lot of different kinds of things that you need to think about during the modeling process. Not a whole lot of theory. A lot of the practical things that are based in theory, but not a lot of theory. And then I just want to demonstrate how easy it is to create point-and-click results using our modeling dashboard. So you can create ridiculously powerful species distribution results at the click of a button. And I guess this module is just highlighting that sometimes that'll work for you. Sometimes that's all you need. And sometimes you might want to dig a little deeper. And hopefully this first module will get you thinking about, well, will I likely need to dig a little deeper or not? So before we get started, though, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting and pay my respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And just to give you a sense of what EcoCommons is, so EcoCommons has this huge vision to become the place where Australian practitioners and researchers can use trusted, world-leading ecological and environmental modeling tools to protect and restore the planet. So there's some wildly complex problems that we're facing in terms of loss of biodiversity or adapting to climate change that's coming. And these are happening at multiple scales right around the planet. And we have some amazing tools to help address those kinds of problems. And we're trying to get as many of those as we can, the scientific workflows, make them available to you so you can protect and restore the planet. And what we really want to do is save you time. So at the end of the day, we want you to focus more on the science and more on the vexing part of the question you're trying to answer, rather than wrangling data or trying to chase up scientific workflows that are hard to find in the literature or whatever it might be. So that's what we're trying to do, but none of it would be possible without the help of our partners, our funders, our collaborators. So there's many organizations listed there. Without them, we wouldn't have the data, we wouldn't have the scientific workflows, we wouldn't have the digital infrastructure, so none of this would be possible. And I just want to go into a little more detail about why we're building EcoCommons, what does it do, and who will it benefit. So first off, again, without all of these, well, EcoCommons is looking to empower researchers and decision makers to protect and restore the planet. We're doing that by drawing on our partners and our collaborators, also our top scientists, to provide ecological data, scientific workflows, and digital infrastructure. And so increasingly, we're seeing more and more things moving to the cloud, and we're seeing increasing levels of environmental data or occurrence data available online. But at EcoCommons, we really want to take that next step and make the scientific workflows that you use with all these vast amounts of data that are available, to make them more widely available, to share them. So today you'll get a glimpse at some of the workflows that are really well developed within an EcoCommons, the species distribution modeling in particular. But we're hoping that more and more of these kinds of workflows will be shared within EcoCommons. And that foundation of knowledge provides users a really easy way to turn noisy ecological data into high quality reproducible results. And you don't need coding skills or expensive equipment to run complex models. We provide easy to use point and click dashboards where you can do some modeling. But we also offer training to give users the chance to run their own code, or they can download the code that was used to run the dashboard models if they want to, and they can explore, they can dig into the details of the modeling. Currently, EcoCommons is a great platform to come and learn about the scientific workflows that we have available, whether you're a student or an early career researcher or somebody who's just never done species distribution modeling before. This is a great place to learn. And importantly, all of our infrastructure is built on flexible architecture, which can be deployed for other projects. So Biosecurity Commons is a project that's able to leverage the tools and the infrastructure that we've built, the architecture, in order to save lots of money. EcoCommons has a budget of about $5 million over 3 years. Biosecurity Commons is able to leverage our infrastructure and architecture to develop a similar kinds of tools for biosecurity decision makers at a price tag of only about $1.5 million. So there's a huge cost savings that our software engineers are sharing very widely. And our users are primarily early career researchers and scientists. But again, we're going to be reaching out more and more to folks in government in order to sort of generate impact more quickly, to inform decisions on the ground. And we're also looking for a growing number of scientists to come on board and share their scientific workflows. All of this is going to be available in November of 2022. So please check in with us and follow us in late November. And we'll tell you how to do that at the end of the tutorial here. But again, there's a lot of vexing environmental problems that we're facing, and EcoCommons is really all about trying to give you tools that'll make it easier to solve those problems. And there's a growing need for ecological modeling. So we're lucky in that EcoCommons is bringing across the functionality that's been available in BCCVL for 5 years. So BCCVL stands for the Biodiversity and Climate Change Virtual Laboratory. And it's been generating species distribution models and projecting what those species distributions might look like in the future for over 5 years. All of that functionality is being brought into EcoCommons. It's being revamped. It'll be faster. So that's one of the core parts of EcoCommons, and it's been around for a long time. So it's BCCVL that's being brought within EcoCommons. And a few years back, in 2016, there was an honors student at UQ that produced some amazing maps. So this is a map looking at the North Pole of planet Earth, and these shaded areas are the predicted suitable climatic niche for this species when it breeds. So it breeds up in northern Russia and comes down to Australia each year. It's a migratory bird. But this is its breeding grounds and its suitable climatic niche in in summer when it's breeding. But under climate change, that suitable habitat almost entirely disappears. So this bird is going to have to adapt to an entirely new ecosystem, an entirely new place in terms of the amount of moisture, the temperature, if it's going to survive. And so why should we be concerned about that? I mean, surely things can adapt to temperature. Well, this is another migratory shorebird. It also breeds up in northern Russia, but it flies down to West Africa each year during the non-breeding season. And this is a red knot. And it's declined by 50% over the decades. So its population has gone from about 500,000 to 250,000. But what's interesting is over that time, knots have become about 15% smaller. They've been measuring them up in Russia and West Africa. And when they're catching these birds, they're seeing, hey, these birds are shrinking. And their bill, has shrunk by about 15%. So why has that happened? Well, it relates to the timing of events or phenology. So the red knot is hardwired to migrate every year at the same time. It's using the position of the sun and the moon and the stars as a calendar and as a clock. And based on those, celestial calendar, it migrates every year at the same time. And it keeps rocking up in northern Russia at the same time. But the snows are melting earlier and earlier every year. And as soon as the snows melt, there's a window of time where the insects start to hatch and they breed, and there's just tons of insects available. And that's happening earlier and earlier in the year, but the red knots are arriving at the same time, year after year. And it's gotten to the point where they're arriving after the peak of insect abundance. And that's a time when the chicks need food. So the chicks are hatching at the same time, but the insects have already come and gone by the time they've hatched. So they don't have as much food to eat. So they're getting smaller. Well, so what? You've got a smaller red knot, not the end of the world. Well, it turns out when these red knots fly down to West Africa, their bills, because they're shorter, they can't reach their preferred prey as often, which are these little bivalves that live under the mud. But their shorter bills can't quite reach them, so they're switching to a more and more vegetarian diet, a diet that doesn't give them the energy stores that they need to make it back up to Russia. So this is all written about in a brilliant science article that came out a number of years ago. But this is why, so we're talking about species distributions and how they might shift, but the biology, and the ecology underneath how those changing conditions are going to impact the species are really hard to predict and hard to fully understand. But it was that species distribution model that tips us off that, well, some of these shorebirds are going to be facing more change than others. Some of them don't have all of their suitable habitat disappearing. So what is species distribution modeling? So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I just want to highlight that, one of my favorite quotes about modeling was by George Box, and he talks about how all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I might change that quote a little bit to say, all models are wrong, sure. Some are useful for science, but almost all models that you work on are useful for learning, maybe just more about the modeling process, but you can always learn from the modeling process. So if we take sort of abstract ideas about modeling and we want to model flying planes, right? And learn about things through those models. Well, this is a really great model of a plane. You can see the shape, you can see the colors, right? But you can't learn anything about flight really from this because it's only going to fly as far as you can hurl it, right? It's not going to fly very well. So it's not going to teach you very much about flight, but it's a great model capturing the shape and color. But if I wanted to have a great model that teaches people about flight, you know, I might build something like this, which is an airfoil. And it really does a great job at highlighting how differences in air pressure can be created by the differences in velocity of air passing under a place that has very little friction and a place that has very high friction. So it's a great model for learning about flight, and they fly surprisingly well across the classroom. And then so many of our models, right, end up something like this. You know, they don't teach us a lot about the shape because we can't really make out what belongs where. They don't teach us a lot about flight because, well, it frankly didn't fly very well. But we still learn something from these failed experiments or pilot investigations, right? You still learn a lot about modeling even if you don't create something that is terribly useful for science. So I just want to highlight, you know, species distribution modeling is all about predicting where species occur in the landscape. Why do they occur in some places but not in others? And this relates to all kinds of things. So there's abiotic factors. You know, it might be too wet for a species or too hot for a species to occur in an area. There might be biotic interactions that are going on. So there might be a predator or a competitor that are changing where this species can occur. And there might be dispersal limitations. You know, kangaroos could probably survive in North America, but they're not there, right? They can't cross the ocean. So there's a lot of things to think about in what makes a species live in one place versus another. And I just want to highlight that a lot of the species distribution modeling that you can do within EcoCommons is looking at this fundamental niche or the potential distribution. So these are all the conditions where the species could be found in environmental space. You know, the amount of rainfall and the amount of temperature where that species occurs includes all of this shaded area, right? But species distribution modeling misses sort of the biological interactions that might be going on, you know, predation or competition, all kinds of things that species distribution modeling won't include. And so this is the realized niche or the actual distribution of the species, right? And we don't generally get a map at the end of a species distribution modeling experiment that captures all the places where it occurs and excludes all the places where it doesn't, because it's not taking into account a lot of the things that define its realized niche or its actual distribution. So when it comes to species distribution modeling, there's an incredible paper that came out a couple of years ago now that gives an excellent overview of the process. You know, you go from first conceptualizing your model, looking through your data, fitting your model, assessing your model, and looking at your predictions. And I would really encourage you to check out this paper. It goes into a lot of detail of all the kinds of things that you want to think about during the modeling process. And I'm just going to be highlighting a few of these things during these videos on species distribution modeling in R. But maybe the most important part of the modeling process is conceptualization, is before you get started. So first you want to define your question. You want to form a hypothesis before you get started. This is exceptionally important if you're doing explanation. So if you're trying to explain the world, why does this species occur here? You need to have a hypothesis that you test. You can't just run the model over and over again until you find your desired result. Right? You need to have a hypothesis going in, and you need to test it with data and a model of how you think the world works. And even if you're just doing prediction, whether it's mapping or transfer, projecting into another location or another time, where do you think this species occurs in other places or at other times? It's still going to pay off if you think a lot about what are you going to need to pull off that model with the available data that you have. And the other thing that you want to think about is, well, why am I doing this? Why am I creating a species distribution model? Maybe I'm learning for the sake of learning, doing pure science. Maybe I'm trying to engage with a wide audience, show what kinds of changes we might expect in the future. Maybe I'm just looking for something or hoping to find something by pure luck, serendipity. I might be trying to track changes. I might have changed conditions on the ground and I want to see what the results of that action were. But if you're doing species distribution modeling for conservation, then it's really important that you confirm that the results of your modeling exercise are going to lead to changes on the ground. They're going to change or inform conservation actions on the ground. And if a model is unlikely to do that in your situation for your stakeholders, then you might want to think about other avenues, other ways to get the kinds of change that you want to occur. But I would say that presenting scientific certainty around the kinds of changes you expect to see in species distributions can be a real game changer for a lot of stakeholders. You just need to think about it before you go in. And what's your purpose? And so I talked about this a little bit already, and there's a great paper that talks about, well, there's 3 primary purposes of developing a species distribution model. You might want to explain the world. You might want to really have the most accurate map of some species that you don't understand super well as you can make. Or you might be looking to project in space or time. So we've got some big project happening in the north, but we haven't done any fauna surveys up there. Are those species up there? Or are those species likely to be impacted over time by things like climate change? So you really, there's a good reason you spend the first year of your PhD thinking about your problem. It's because it's a critical part of the process. So I would encourage you to really think a lot before you get started. Because at the end of the day, species distribution model is very simple. You take some species data, you take some environmental data, an algorithm is used to work through that data and create a map of where we think that species is likely to occur. And there's a number of different kinds of species distribution models. So you've got geographic models. These are very simple models. So this is a convex hull. So we're just drawing points around or drawing a polygon around the points. Right? Very simple. Sometimes that's all you need. And we can get a little more fancy, so we can say, well, as you get further away from that occurrence point, we think the probability of finding my species goes down. But even that, we're only using presence data for where your species occurs. We're not using environmental data. We're just using distance and latitude and longitude, so position and distance. So fairly simple models, but again, sometimes that's all you need. And another relatively simple model is looking at how your species is likely to be distributed given the environmental conditions that it's found within. So this is called identifying a species' environmental space. So if we know that this species only occurs, so if environmental variable 1 on the x-axis is temperature, we know it can occur in places that are too cold or too hot. So this is the range of temperature where it can occur. Maybe variable 2 is rainfall on the y-axis. And so your environmental space are all of the places on the planet which have these environmental conditions. And so when you map environmental space onto geographic space, you don't get these, nice little sort of envelopes of where things occur. You don't get a cloud of data and that's where they occur. When you pop those into geographic space, you do get some interesting results. Some places where it's really likely to occur and some places where it's less likely to occur, just based on presence records and the environmental data. So you need some environmental data to define that environmental space. And again, those are fairly simple models, but most of the species distribution modeling that's done are kind of correlative models. So this is a good example of ecological niche modeling or species distribution modeling. And essentially, if we look at a grid of the area that we're interested in, we might find that a lot of our grid cells have green squares. And it turns out birds tend to be in those areas with green squares. So then we can look in the future, or we can look in an area where we haven't sampled and look where are those green squares. That's where we expect birds will also be found. And these green squares are all related to the environmental conditions within that square. So how hot is it? How dry is it? Those kinds of things. And there's different kinds of correlative models. So these are statistical models, and generally they can be very good at generating predictions if you really understand the model and the relationships between variables. But they tend to be best for explanation or inference. So if I want to know how the world works, machine learning algorithms are getting to a point where they're doing a decent job of explaining some of that, but the literature has been around for a lot longer using statistical techniques, and generally you're going to get a more rigorous answer if you go through the process of building and validating a statistical model. And you can do all kinds of different things. So this is binary, presence-absence data fit with a binomial GLM. If your relationship between presences and environmental data is not linear, GAMs are a good way to go. This is a specific kind of nonlinear model, a Mars model. There's all kinds of things that you can do, right? And a lot of those are available within EcoCommons now. You need some kind of response variable. So you need either presence-absence data or you need abundance data. You need something, a variable that you're predicting. So, and then there's these machine learning models, and they have become exceptionally popular over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years even. It's often these models are best at predictions, and especially if you don't really have a good understanding of everything that's involved in where a species might be distributed, you're going to get a better answer with a machine learning model than you will with most other models generally. Not always. And Maxent is really popular because you don't need presence and absence data. You can have presence data compared to the background data. So that's randomly chosen places across your study area. So often you don't have presence and absence data, but both the statistical models and a lot of these machine learning models will require you to have a response variable that is either presence, absence, or maybe abundance. These are tree-based models, also very good at predicting, and artificial neural networks. They're relatively new on the scene, and often a simple tree-based model will do as well or better than an artificial neural network. These are generally best suited to very complex problems. But again, you need environmental data to make them work. And usually, except for with Maxent, you need a response variable. So again, coming back to this, you need to plan your question, and you need to be careful of the research practices that you're undertaking. So it's most important if your purpose is to explain, well, this is why this species is there. You need a hypothesis. You need to form those expectations of what you think you're going to find before you get started. Because you can just relentlessly run a model over and over again, tweaking little things until you get a p-value that's, somehow magical. And if you run 20 models, you're going to find a significant p-value for most problems, right? So it's not the way to go about research. And you also want to avoid presenting only those favorable bits of evidence while concealing evidence that maybe don't support your hypothesis. So you want to be transparent. Sharing your code is one way to do that. And I guess if your purpose is mapping or predicting across space or time, you can iteratively model. You can, keep modeling and tweaking and retrying things as long as you validate that model really well. If your purpose, again, is predicting where in the landscape something occurs. As long as you validate that model really well, you can get away with sort of more almost data dredging practices to get you there. And it's important to think on, does the available data match your question? So if we had highly structured systematic data across your study area, where in all the places that are important or potentially important for this species, you've done the same survey technique over and over again across time, right? You have amazing data, and when you haven't found that species, you've recorded zeros. Those kinds of data are great, right? You can use a simple GLM and get good predictions, and you can get a good map and a good explanation of what variables are important for your species. So systematic data opens up the door to just about everything, and it usually doesn't require these more complex techniques, right? You can get away with doing things that are fairly simple, and it does a good job of explaining what you need to explain. But the problem with biodiversity data across the planet is we haven't even described many species on the planet, let alone have data on where they occur, right? So a lot of biodiversity data is very unstructured or opportunistic. And that's where some of these more complex methods really come into their own. We're doing things in 2022 that in 1990 would have been unthinkable in terms of generating highly accurate predictions given the data. We're just able to do so much more in the last 30 years. And it's because we have some ways to deal with this unstructured and opportunistic data. And So I just want to talk a little bit about sampling bias, because in most biodiversity data, there's a lot of sampling bias. So if we look at this map on the left, this is a map that shows all of the places where bird surveys have ever been done in the state of Queensland, Australia. Right? Those black areas are places where nobody has ever done a bird survey. You could go to one of these black areas, count the number of birds that you see of a variety of species, submit that into a database, and you would be the first person to have done so. But in these areas where the cities are, as you get blue and purple, there's a lot more surveys that have been done in these areas, heaps of surveys, bird surveys. And if we zoom in on this area, so that's southeast Queensland, and that's what this map in the middle is, you can see, there's still some places where you could go and be a pioneer in southeast Queensland. So not that far from the city, you could go and do a bird record and, be the first one to do so in that area. But most of our data is where the city is densest, where the most people live is where we have the most data. So if somebody were to give me $100 million and they want me to set aside a bird reserve, buy a private piece of property that'll capture the most number of threatened birds possible. If I just naively looked at the raw data, and I looked, well, if I look at the raw data, these areas in blue are the private properties near Brisbane where there's the most threatened bird species occurring, right? You mean there's no threatened bird species out here in the farms and, the forests out further out from town? Of course there are. But there isn't, it takes a lot of sampling before you finally pick up that threatened species. And there just isn't enough sampling out here in these parts of southeast Queensland to tell us where these things are. So one of the reasons species distribution modeling is so important in the context in which we're generally doing it is we're usually interested in these places. With my $100 million, I could buy a pretty big property out here. But I'm really not sure which one has the most bird species that are threatened, for example. So how do you decide? There's all these different kinds of models, all these kinds of different things you can do, and we'll talk about more of that as we go in. But sometimes, I would encourage you to start simple. If your species only occurs above 800 meters in elevation, a geographic model might be all you need, is something that just highlights those mountain tops where your species is likely to occur. Similar, if your species really has a narrow environmental profile where it occurs, it has to be really wet and rainforest vegetation and, not too hot. Maybe a profile model is all you need. But statistical regression models and machine learning models are kind of the next step in complexity. So we'll talk more about how to decide on those things later. But first, I just wanted to highlight that you can also do climate projections. So you can create a species distribution model in EcoCommons, and then you can project that model into the future. And the reason you can do that is because some very clever people have built these climate models. And these climate models are able to predict how the climate is going to change over time based on all of these factors that affect the climate. So because we have an understanding of all of these factors, we can predict across space and time what the climate's likely to be like in different places and at different times. And that's becoming increasingly important because as the amount of CO2 rises, right, we've got sun that's being absorbed by the atmosphere, but less of that heat is being radiated back out to space because we have this blanket of CO2 covering the atmosphere. And if we look at this, this graph, well, this is, the parts per million of CO2. And these different lines relate to different emission scenarios. So if we stop generating excess greenhouse gases and even start or stabilize them almost right now, we're still going to get a rise in temperature, but that's likely going to stabilize if we act on climate change. And that's called the representative concentration pathway. So that's our one pathway, 2.6 it's called, but that equates to about 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. But if we don't do anything about climate change, we keep doing what we're doing and we keep burning maybe even more fuel, right? Creating even more emissions. We could get all the way up here by the year 2100, where we've got almost 5 degrees Celsius of warming, and we're faced with a very different world. So we've got two things at work here. We've got a climate model and sort of an emissions projection of how things might be. So we take that emissions projection and we use that climate model to generate a future projection of how warm are different places, how much warming is there going to be across the planet. So again, if we're going to take a species distribution model and project it into the future, we take our initial species distribution model, then we pick, well, are we feeling pessimistic or optimistic? Which emissions pathway are we likely on? And which of many general circulation models are we going to choose? And those things will produce a result of how you expect this species to change. So this one looks like it will shift, its distribution could shift more to the south if other conditions are right. But the climatic conditions suggest this bat will shift to the south. And these decisions are not trivial, and they will affect your model. There's a good paper here that talks about, well, what kinds of things do you need to think about when you're picking a climate model? Essentially, you want to pick a climate model that works best in the environment that you're predicting. So if there's a climate model that works really well in mountains, which is really hard to develop a climate model for, you want to choose that one. So there's a variety of things to think about in this process. But within EcoCommons, you can very simply create a current species distribution map. So this is the Leadbetter's possum, right? And this is the mountain ash that the Leadbetter's possum relies on. So that's its current predicted suitable climatic niche, right? And this is how those things are likely to change in the future under a pessimistic climate change projection emission scenario of 8.5, and by the year 2075. This is how you expect things to change. And if you look at the change in range, you can see there's going to be a lot more habitat for mountain ash in Tasmania in the future. So anyway, these are the kinds of things that you can experiment with really quickly within EcoCommons. So I just want to give you a demonstration first of the kinds of things that you can do in EcoCommons using the dashboard. So first, if you go to the EcoCommons website and you click, there's a little button on the upper right, you can get to our login page. If you're a student, or if you're with an organization or a research institution that's registered for the Australian Access Federation, you can log in here, and that's the easiest way to go. But if you can't get to us through that, currently we're just asking that you send us an email and we'll develop an EcoCommons account for you and send you the details. So you can just go to the Contacts Us page on the EcoCommons website and get in touch with us if you need a login, if that AAF login is not working. But once you get there, you'll have the opportunity to either go to visit our modeling wizards or our coding cloud. So you can code within EcoCommons. And certainly we would encourage you to try to use that for the species distribution and R materials that we present later. But we want to highlight what you can do in these modeling wizards. So we'll have a couple more modeling wizards coming. Right now, the modeling wizard that's there is the BCCVL modeling wizard. If you click on that, you'll see all the available data that's within EcoCommons, and you can view that data, you can look at the metadata for that data, or you can download that data. And we've got a couple thousand data sets available here, and then we've got this other place called Knowledge Network, which has another 5,000 data sets that you can download. And that's through our partnership with the Knowledge Network that runs through CSIRO. So there's a lot of environmental data that's available. And you know, if you just do a search up here, well, you get a couple of the vegetation layers that are available. And again, you can preview those data if you want to. You can download them, look at the metadata. And then you can go to the dashboard. And so this is, you know, where you can do the various things that you might want to do as a user. And from that dashboard, you can go to import data. So if you want to import some data, and maybe you want to do a search for Banksia species, right? And you want to search the ALA, so the Atlas of Living Australia's database. You just type that in here. You can also choose GBIF data. There's a couple other data sets that we also have. And you can select some data and download it into the system. Once you've done that, once you've selected some occurrence data, so you need to choose your species and choose your occurrence data, and we'll have the ability to filter those occurrence data within EcoCommons. So if you only want records from the last 10 years, because that's when your environmental data was collected, you can select those records. If you only want records from a certain custodian, you can select those records. So there's a variety of ways that you can filter out those occurrence records. But once you've downloaded them, you can open up the modeling wizard and go to the BCCVL analysis hub. And if we're going to click on species distribution modeling experiment, there's a number of different things that you can do here. And we've got support materials on what the different models do. But we're going to start with a species distribution model. You give that model a name. So you've got these tabs across the top. We start with this tab, give it a description, go to the next page, upload those occurrence records into your experiment page. So these are the records that you downloaded already. So this is a species of Banksia in southwest Western Australia. You can view those records, so you can view the map of where those records were collected. Then you can select different ways of selecting absences. So if you're working in Maxent, you don't need absences. And if you don't have true absence data, if you do have true absence data, you can upload it. But if you don't have true absence data, there's a number of ways you can generate pseudo absence data. And we'll talk more about the trade-offs involved in that. But if you're trying to predict well, I would recommend that you choose a strategy that's a disk, and you choose, maybe it depends on how far, so your occurrence record, if your species has a small home range, then you might want to say, well, anything that's over 100 meters away is probably a different individual or pair. But you don't want to go further than 10 kilometers away or whatever it might be. So these distances, you want to be at least this far away, but no further than this second number away. Just gives you a random way to select records in similar environments, but unlikely to be in the same home range or whatever it might be of your species. So that's the way I'd recommend, but there's some other things that you can select, and again, there's support materials on which steps you might want to choose. You then need to select some environmental data, so you can do that from within your experiment. And here we select, vegetation type and some bioclim variables. So Australia's current climate at about 1 kilometer resolution. If your environmental data are at different resolutions, you can scale it to the coarsest resolution, which is generally what people recommend to do, but you can also scale it to the finest resolution if you want to. So yeah, you'll change the resolution if you need to. And essentially, when you're doing a species distribution modeling experiment, all of your data need to line up. So they need to have the same extent, the same study area exactly, the same size of grid cells, so the same resolution, and the same coordinate reference system. So the way these environmental data are projected onto a map of the Earth need to match across each one of those layers that you're using. If you're using our data, that's easy. And if you're not using our data, we'll take you through steps to show you how to do that in R. So you can upload your own environmental data as well. And then the constraints are just your study area. So you can define your study area in a variety of different ways. Here I've just drawn a polygon around southwest Western Australia. You can then choose your algorithm. So there's all kinds of algorithms to choose from. Here I'm going to choose a boosted regression tree. Probably bump up this tree complexity to maybe a 3, but otherwise happy to leave all these other model arguments as their default values. And over time, we'll sort of develop more and more support articles around, well, what does this mean? And what are the implications of changing some of these model argument numbers? But for now, we'll just keep it fairly simple. The tree complexity relates to how many interactions do you expect there are between the variables. So if I changed it to 3, that means I suspect that it's like adding an interaction term in statistics. As the temperature rises and it gets wetter, temperature and water are both important, but when they come together, that's the best scenario, right? So they're most important if like those two terms are multiplied together. That's the kind of thing you get in interactions in statistical models. A tree deals with them sort of automatically in the way it breaks and forms trees, deals with those kinds of interactions automatically as long as you bump up the tree complexity to more than 1. Then you just hit run and you start your experiment. And presto changeo, you get some results. So this is what the current distribution looks like. This map I just cut and paste in here, so this didn't actually come out in the output, but that's what the future distribution is going to look like. So it looks like there'll be more suitable habitat for this species up in the north if climate change scenarios eventuate, right? But these blue areas, both currently and in the future, a lot of areas are going to be unsuitable for this species of Banksia. So very quickly you get a result, a map. And you get response curves. So does it make sense that bioclim 12 is going to change? So I think that's relates to precipitation. So does it make sense that as it's drier, I'm not going to have very many Banksia, but as it gets wetter, right, I'm going to get more Banksia, for example. You also get an indication of, well, of all the variables that I tried, which ones were the important ones, which ones were the most important ones, and you get those automatically generated in your results. You get a sense of how well you captured across different thresholds. How well am I capturing presence and absence? How well is my model performing? We'll talk a lot about this in one of the later modules, but this is pretty good. 1.0 is perfect, so 0.92 is pretty good. You've got a lot of area under this curve, this receiver operator curve. You get all kinds of model accuracy statistics. Again, we'll go through those more in a later video. But all of this is generated automatically. And one of the things I like best about this platform is, let's say I'm not familiar with artificial neural networks at all. I could sit down, I could run the model, and then I'll get this job script in R. So it gives me all the code that was used to generate that model. So I can then have a think about, well, do I want to run it again in the point and click dashboard, or do I want to take this code and refine it and run it in the coding cloud on EcoCommons? So everything that's done is fully reproducible, and you can take a look at the code of any model that you run in the point and click dashboards. And if you do want to code, if you clicked on that coding cloud at the beginning, you can run, you can launch different kinds of environments. So you can do things in RStudio, you can do things in base R within Jupyter notebooks, or you can do things in Python. So there's a lot of options for your modeling. If you choose RStudio, which is probably one of the more common tools that's used in ecological modeling for our community generally, it looks just like RStudio would look on your laptop. What's nice about it is we'll have libraries of code that you can draw from, and you can run that code, set it up just like you would on your laptop, but you can hit run, and then you can turn your laptop off. You can go grab dinner, whatever you want to do, and it will run, while you're doing other things. So you can set up the run and run it and save your computer's processor by doing that. And it does everything you'd expect a coding environment to do, whether you're working in Python or R. And again, this is where we would encourage you to try the species distribution in R code that we provide as part of these modules. So just a word of caution again. I've given you a lot of information on other things that you should think about, but there's a lot of uncertainty in species distribution modeling, right? And we've only really scratched the surface of some of the things that you need to think about. I'd urge you to look at that paper very closely if you're trying to really do this seriously. But keep in mind that models are all models are wrong, right? They're only a representation of the real world. They might teach you something, they might not. Most of these models don't pick up the species interactions that are also influencing the distribution of the species that you're studying, right? Sometimes you can come up with proxies that capture some of that actual distribution, but oftentimes you're going to miss, you're going to overpredict where the species likely is. We can't have 30 trials of raising the temperature of the Earth to see how a species distribution is affected, right? So there's limited capability to validate some of these kinds of models, but we do work through some of the things that can give you what's likely to be a more accurate prediction. And again, there's other impacts like land use change and all kinds of things that might be happening in the future aside from climate change. So there's just a lot to think about, and I just want to highlight again that that's important. I will say, you know, this map is great for generating awareness about the potential impacts of climate change, right? So a map is a very tangible thing for a wide variety of people. A lot more audiences have an appreciation of a map, and this is a great way to demonstrate what might be coming in the future. But I also want to highlight that you can develop species distribution models that are accurate enough to really inform planning decisions and regulation. So this is an example of a species distribution model which used really high resolution predictors, so really fine scale data that was highly accurate. And it also did something that's a bit unusual. So it tested it with, it tested model predictions using radio telemetry data. So all of these light gray areas are places where the species or the habitat for this owl is predicted to be unsuitable. These darker gray areas are places where it's predicted to be highly suitable. And these black areas are places where the owl is actually using based on radio telemetry data. And you can see there's a nice correlation between the places you predict the owl is likely to occur and the place that it actually occurs. And these maps are viewed as good enough to help provide planning layers to councils and state planners on, you know, when we're making planning decisions to plan for this vulnerable species, which areas do we want to avoid? Well, we probably can want to avoid this area, but we might not need to avoid this area. That's good information, right? And it's worked right across the state of Victoria. I think one of the things that has hurt the credibility of species distribution modeling most has been generating a map and then giving it to a broad audience in the wrong format. So if I create, you know, a species distribution model across a wide range, right? And I might do that at a pretty coarse scale. But this, if I'm looking at the whole range, it really tells me, you know, this owl doesn't go that far north in Queensland, right? It doesn't go that far west. It gives me a good understanding of generally where does this owl occur. And it was built to do that. But if I give somebody a KML file that they can zoom in on, so they can zoom in on every one of these little polygons, and they go, well, hang on, this is mangrove forest. That owl's not going to occur in mangrove forest. You guys are off your nut. Your models don't mean anything. Well, that's not what this model was designed for, right? It was designed to give you a good understanding of where in Queensland it occurs, and it does that. It might overestimate some of the places where it might be, but again, this is not what it was designed to do. So you might want to just give your audience a PDF map, something they can't zoom into. And the same goes if you did something at really coarse resolution. A manager isn't going to find this really coarse resolution predictions very helpful for city planners, for example, are making decisions about areas that are much smaller than this, right? So I think you have to consider your audience and that they get the modeling results that you intended. Not that so they can't over infer based on your results. And one of the other things that's becoming increasingly important if you want to publish is that you're able to visualize uncertainty in geographic and environmental space. So, and the first part of that comes to understand, well, how well did I sample the distribution of my species, right? So if these little points are sampling locations, and there's a great paper on this that we highlight later, but if all these little colorful dots are where we sampled and all the gray areas are the actual environmental space, you can see that, these are different sampling regimes, but a lot of them pick up a lot of the environmental space, even those places that are really cold and have high amounts of rainfall. Like some of those have been picked up. And most of your sampling is capturing most of the environmental space that's available in your study area. So that's important to know. Then you can generate a map that highlights, well, these are the places that weren't sampled well. This is the environmental space that's almost entirely based on model predictions, not on actual data. You can do the same thing with geographic space. So how well was my species range sampled in geographic space? And then you can highlight in the maps, so this is a map of the predicted distribution of a cockatoo, but you might want to shade this area because, we didn't really have any sampling out this, down this far in WA. So this area is just sort of a best guess. Or maybe the environmental conditions that are here, it's just a best guess because these environmental conditions weren't actually sampled. Doing that kind of thing, making sure that you're delivering maps that reflect fully the uncertainty in your modeling results is going to be better for everyone. And this is the kind of thing that's being done more and more. Now I just want to highlight that there's a few use cases that are available within EcoCommons, and there's more that we're developing. And I want to highlight, you can use the point and click environment, the point and click dashboards, and that might be all you need to create the model result that you need. So we generated, after these huge bushfires in 2019, 2020, ecologists right around Australia were curious how their favorite species had been impacted by these bushfires. And so they developed species distribution models for these species and then would overlay the places that were burned, based on the NASA data, what places were burned. And to give them some indication of, well, what's the percentage of habitat? In our case, we were looking at superb lyrebird and greater sooty owl that was burnt in the fires. And we found that we got very similar results from BCCVL, so this modeling wizard that we're talking about, using the point and click environment as they got in other studies. So this is a paper. This is BirdLife did some work. This is a group of researchers that did some work. We get very similar results. But the species distribution modeling that we did only took about 15 minutes to put together for each one of these species. It took a little longer than that to overlay the fire data, and we had to do some things in R outside of this. But to generate that species distribution model, it was really quick. And we got a real quick understanding of, look, it looks like about a third of these species habitat, a third to 40%, somewhere in there, was lost in these bushfires, or was impacted. not necessarily lost, but was at least impacted by fire. That's a quick result. That gives you more time to explore other things, right? If you get that quick result, you can then go, well, how did fire intensity impact these species? Or you can dig into other questions more deeply if you can create that first result really quickly. And we've demonstrated that you can, in fact, do that using the tools available in EcoCommons. Again, I wouldn't say our model of all the models that are presented here is necessarily the best one, but all of them are wrong. And it turns out, in this case, all of them are useful because they're all telling us a similar story. So that's just giving you an overview of what's available at EcoCommons. If you've never coded in R, before you get started with this module, I'd really encourage you to visit this website and to visit our educational materials. So Amelia does a great job of taking people through learning how to use R. And there's a couple of videos on that you can check out. There's also use cases that you can check out. You can download the code and see how they work. And we present use cases on how to do different things. So check out our website. It's ecocommons.org.au if you want to dig in more to the educational materials that are available. So there's a lot of support articles that describe these things in more detail. The algorithms themselves are really described well in another series of videos that have been around for a while. They were created during the days of BCCVL. And if you're using the platform, there'll be a little feedback button. So if you do happen to visit EcoCommons, if you want to highlight anything that you think is wonderful or anything that is a bug, it's not working right, you can click on that feedback button and enter in a comment and let us know what kinds of changes you might want. And just keep in mind, we're not launching until November 2022. So if you do jump on before then, just understand that it's a work in progress. It might shut down occasionally. You might want to back up your work. So if you'd like to learn more about what EcoCommons is doing, everything that you can get involved with, what our partners are doing, I'd encourage you to sign up to our newsletter. You can do that at our website as well, so ecocommons.org.au. And again, just want to really thank all of our partners, our funders, our collaborators who make all of this work possible. And thank you for tuning in. Again, the next 4 modules will cover coding up your occurrence data and the things you need to think about there. It'll include coding your environmental data. It'll include fitting your models, and the 4th video in that series of 4 will include how to validate that model. So if you're interested in how to do the coding step, please check out those other videos.